All right, well, welcome here and his writing custom Nagios plugins. Please welcome and make him feel welcome, Nathan Vonnahme.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Let's get started. So, why should you write? Why would anyone want to extend the amazing array of plugins already available to you with Nagios? That gets back to, for me, that gets back to why I started using Nagios in the first place. I had read about Nagios, and my coworker that I shared duties with decided to go on vacation one time, and before he left, he gave me his list of everything he checks every day, and I was like, I'm not doing that. And while he was on vacation, I started implementing Nagios to take care of his checklist. And there were things on his checklist that were more involved than you can get with any of the normal check scripts, even though there are a lot of good ones. And it turns out that life is actually more complicated than whether or not a machine can ping or whether a certain port is responding to traffic. And so I've actually done probably at least as much with custom plugins as with the standard ones in our environment. We could really use any tool to make plugins. I've seen examples here at the conference of Shell and PowerShell and batch files and carrier pigeon. Not really, but I'm going to show examples starting in Perl because that I think is still one of the most robust environments. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. I've been playing with Node.js and JavaScript, so I'll show an example of that. That's kind of a little less crusty than Perl is getting these days. And then I'll show you an example using Autoit, which is should just kind of open your mind to the possibilities of what you can do with plugins. Okay. Anybody here use Perl normally? Yeah, so you know. It's awesome. I love Perl. One of the good things specific to Nagios is the Nagios plugin API in Perl. It's very well supported, and it provides a lot of the tools you need to make something that's not just a bare bones plugin that returns 0 or 1, but something that has documentation and is thresholds and performance data that's going to be easier for people after you or you in 6 months to figure out again. If you don't like Perl, don't worry. There's more to it than just the punctuation, but if you just translate the punctuation into other characters, then it'll be like whatever your language of choice is. Originally, last year, I did the same talk, and we tried to do a hands-on thing. If you want to follow along, start out with Perl. I noticed last year that a lot of people we're not, at this point in the conference, we're not ready to follow along, and so they're just observing, which is fine. There's a video of last year's talk already up. If you want to go back, when you get back to your desk and work through these examples. And these videos will be up at some point too. So the place to start, regardless of your language, is the developer guidelines. This document really spells out the expectations that the community has had since, 2000, it says, the first copyright, for how plugins should behave. So when in doubt, make it match this document. And we're going to start out with a very simple script. We're going to write a script to check that a backup succeeded. Okay, we're going to make sure that our backup file is All right. Make sure that the backup file exists. So this is a full plugin in Perl. We're going to take the first argument off the command line. We're going to print OK if it exists. That's the -e flag, similar to shell. And we'll say it's critical if it isn't. Anybody see any problems with this? This will work great, right? We can save it and run it with one argument. We give it the name of a file. Then when we create that file, it's OK. Our backup is good, right? And then tomorrow, our zero-length foo.tar.gzip will also be OK. It will always be OK. It will always be a good backup. Yeah, but maybe a zero-length backup maybe isn't OK. Maybe a 6-month-old zero-length backup maybe isn't OK. You know, it's a little more complicated than you might guess on the first try. So we're going to go a little deeper. We're going to check that not only does it exist, but it's less than a certain number of hours old, and it's between a certain size range that we expect. Now, really, it would be good to check that it was a restorable backup or that there was something valuable in those that backup file, but we'll leave that to advanced users. We're also going to go from just using, a plain Perl script to using the Nagios plugin library, and we can show all the things that we can do with that to make it not just a hack together little thing that you forget about and then have to figure out again in 6 months, but fully supported plugin that's ready to distribute. And actually dealing with these things like the arguments and the help documentation make up the majority of the code. So using the Nagios plugin, module gives you all those bells and whistles and Cowbell too. Ton Voon and Gavin Carr, I think, are responsible for most of the plugin, and they have been great. I've worked with them on email and stuff, and Ton Voon is no longer, he was maintaining the whole plugins project, and he stepped away from that, but he's still using Nagios. So, all right, so this is the pain point with Perl and Nagios plugin is, I've noticed that, remember DLL hell from Windows 3.1 days, where you'd have one prerequisite and then the new software would require an older version of a DLL, and you'd get in this whole snarl. As far as I can tell, every environment has its own version of DLL hell. For Linux, it's the RPM packaging distribution system, and there are various solutions to that problem. For Windows, they've kind of gone with Windows Update to hide most of DLL hell from you, but you still might need multiple versions of .NET installed. And each new language these days has its own package manager for solving DLL hell. Anyway, for Perl, it's cpan. You need to install Nagios plugin, and you need to have a working cpan to do that. The hard part about this in production environments is often the proxy business, getting access to the internet, because we want to be able to download code from the internet and run it on our machines as root. But I guess that's kind of what Linux is all about, right? This example that I'm going to be walking through now is available at this URL. And, actually, no, I started with the check stuff PLL, or PL is an example script from the Nagios plugin distribution. And you can use this to start any Perl plugin. It kind of has the normal stuff set up for you, so you can just change the middle of the plugin where the action happens. And we're going to be turning this sample script into our check backup example. The finished example is here. So you can download the check backup script that I'm going to be walking through now. And the sections in this document here match the next series of slides. Okay, anybody need more time? Good. Okay, so we'll save this sample script, checkstuffpl, as our checkbackup.pl. Change the shebang line to refer to wherever our Perl is. And if we run it with no arguments, we should get unknown. Well, yeah, because it requires a threshold argument. So then we get to the next part, which is designing how our arguments should work. In our case, because of our specification that we wrote at the beginning, we want the file name of a backup file to check, and how many hours to expect, and the size in megabytes. These will be plugin ranges. We'll follow the plugin standard for how they define ranges because it's very flexible. We also have to think about how our thresholds are going to work. And I've decided that if the backup file doesn't exist at all, that should be critical. If the age is too old, like if the backup failed last night, we expect it to succeed every 24 hours, then we'll say that's critical. And if it's outside the size range, we expect a 100 to 200 meg backup file. We'll just make that a warning. So at the beginning of the script, we import, use strict and use warnings. Every self-respecting Perl script starts that way. We import the Nagios plugin module and the file stat module, which we'll see later. We declare some variables that we're going to use. These are global variables. And then we set the base name, which shows up in the plugin output. We use that from the file name. So $0 is the executing script name. And so that's check_stuff.pl. And we're going to just use check_stuff as the name of our program. That shows up as the first word in the output. So right here, my check backup in this example. All right, so if you've started from checkstuff.pl, you have a sample usage statement that we now add our new arguments to. We update the example section. Now, this is nice because it makes it, just like the other real plugins. And then we do one of these add arg stanzas for each of our arguments to supply additional help and default values. So the default, we're going to make the age argument optional and default it to 24 hours. We're going to make the file name argument mandatory, required, and let's see, the size one is also optional. And then the GetOps module uses the GetOps, GetOps standard. It's included in Nagios plugin. And that processes all the arguments that come in on the command line and matches it up with the things you've just defined. So now our plugin is already RTFM enabled, just like other plugins. You can give it the -H, or if you run it with no arguments, because the file argument is mandatory, it says, no, that's impossible, and prints out the usage statement. If you give it the help argument, then we get a full, almost a full man page, and it matches the other plugins because they do it this way too. We get each of the arguments documented, including the built-in ones like timeout and verbose. And then we have our example section that we added at the bottom. That's always, I'm always in a hurry, and so I usually skip to the example section and try and figure it out from there. So I always like to include that when I'm actually documenting something. So in the middle of checkstuff.pl, right before the actual action happens, we do a little bit more validation on the arguments to make sure that they actually are sane. Like if you were connecting to a database to run some sort of a more involved metric, whether you're measuring your business processes or whatever it is, at this point you might want to just make sure that you can connect to the database and die if there was no password supplied or whatever, however you're doing it. In this case, we're just like if you supply a age less than 0, we're going to say that doesn't make any sense. Make sure it exists. Now, one thing in this next section, the actual meat of the plugin, I ran into a gotcha with embedded Perl. At first, I used the -N switch, which gives you the script starts. It gives you the age of a file, but it's the age of the file relative to the time that the script started running. And I got this strange error in Nagios. It said it was -9 hours old. And the reason why is, when I looked at the documentation, I realized, so actually the script started running before the backup was created. So that's why it makes sense, right? -9, it's perfectly consistent with the documentation. But because of embedded Perl, the script stayed in memory, stayed ready to run the next time. Anyway, so if you, it looks like in 4.0 they're turning off embedded Perl. So that particular gotcha won't get you anymore. So here's the actual check. We're going to make sure it exists and return critical if it doesn't. We're going to use the file stat mtime, the file stat module to get the modified time of the file rather than the -m flag. And we convert it to hours. We make sure that the size is converted to megabytes. The underscores are just in Perl, they're just for visual. That's just an integer of 1 million. So you can include underscores in your numbers. That next time you're obfuscating Perl, you can take advantage of that. And then we format a human-readable message to go along with our plugin output. Then we can also define, with these stanzas, we define the plugin performance data, which takes these things that we've just calculated, the age and the size, and puts them in the string at the end after the pipe in the plugin output. And that allows all those pretty RRD graphs and all that stuff. Then at the end, we've already checked for file existence. So we use the check threshold command built into the Nagios plugin to check the thresholds that have been defined on the, check the values that we just calculated, age in hours and size in megabytes, against the parsed thresholds that have been come in on the command line. So I know the thresholds, they look simple at first. Like you can just use one number, check disk 90, and then as you start working with them, you realize that there's kind of a complex syntax. The Nagios plugin module takes care of all that syntax for you, and then it figures out with the check threshold, it just figures out whether this particular value means okay or warning or critical. So if we pass the first one and it's okay, then we run the second one. Otherwise, we just return the failure from the first one. And then we use Nagios exit to set the return code and the message. And by the way, officially, the thing that is supposed to matter, according to the plugin document, is not any of the output of the script, but just the return code. So 0 is success, 1 is warning, 2 is critical, and 3 is unknown. Some tools seem to look for OK, warning, or critical in the first line of the output. So it's, I always include both, and you want it to be human readable anyway. But anyway, one of the Windows clients, and NRP, one of the older Windows clients only used the visible readout and not the return code. Okay, so here are examples of the script that we just wrote failing when we give it thresholds. We have I made a half meg file that's 3 hours old, and in this case it's 23 hours old, and the size is okay. But the size we expect 100 to 900 megabytes, and it's only half a megabyte, so we warn on that one. On this one, we expect it to be 8 hours old, but it's 23 hours old, so that means it's too old, and so we return critical. You define your script that you've just written, your plugin, as a command in your configuration, and set up the arguments, and you're ready to go. If you're running this on another host, which I tend to run most things on the whatever host system is, and then use NRPE to access that from Nagios. Everything works the same way. So this plugin can either run on the Nagios host or on a remote host with one of these libraries installed, or one of these Nagios clients installed. You do have to have a working Perl on each platform, but this particular one that I just wrote, I actually have running basically that same script in production on Windows and on Linux. I don't know if I have. I don't know if we're using it on AIX, but it's ready to go. Here's an example using the check-nt script to connect to the older pre-NS client, Windows client, and it runs it, ready to go. Then you can put your, anybody know which Cowbell that is? It's ShareBear. So put your plugin on exchange.nagios.org and share it with the community, and you'll be famous, and and you'll feel good because sharing is caring. Okay, so you could use any language, anything you want. All it really has to do is return that return code, and you can hard code everything in your cryptic script and not do any argument processing, whatever. But eventually, if you work a lot with a certain language, you might want to consider making a library to make the argument processing, threshold management, range checking, and the documentation, the help documentation. You might want to look at Nagios plugin in Perl and kind of emulate that in your other language. Any questions so far about the Perl example? Yeah?
With your output data, make it right size, like capitalizations, nice, like size, capital S, age, capital A, things like that. It just makes it prettier when you look at it later.
Yeah.
It's just, I'm anal like that.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it's gonna, yeah. That's part of the reason for bothering with the help screens and things like that too. Is, you know, when you come across it, I do this for myself because when I come across it in 6 months, and I see what a tangled mess of crap it was, my opinion of myself goes even lower, and I'm like, oh, who wrote this piece of junk? But it's the same, you know, whether it's other users out on the internet who are using your plugin off of exchange.nagios.org, or whether it's the boss reading the status message on the pager and it's got a typo in it. Whatever. Actually, my boss never reads status messages on pagers. But I think she knows what Nagios is, I think. So yeah, Larry Wall, who invented Perl, he said that one of the qualities of a good programmer is hubris. It's the gall to think that what you're doing is awesome enough to like give it to other people and make sure that, you know, and to actually put in the effort to think that. And it's been funny, like every time preparing for this, going to the other talks, I've been flip-flopping between thinking, oh, I'm the dumbest person at this conference, or thinking like, oh yeah, this is going to be cool, everybody's going to like this, you know, I'm going to offer something of value. So anyway, just do it. Just make it good. You'll appreciate it 6 months later. You'll be able to share it without being quite so ashamed. It's worth doing. All right, so Node. I've been playing with Node lately and writing more JavaScript lately. The creator of Node, Ryan Dahl, he recently, I thought that this was a great quote. Node's problem is that some of its users want to use it for everything. So what? That's a problem. Node is not actually good for writing something like a plugin, but we're going to do it anyway. All the cool kids that I meet on the internet, like the 19-year-old brilliant programmers, they're writing JavaScript, they're using Node. Even Doug Crockford, who's he's like 80, 90 years old, and he's got a grizzly white beard. He's a JavaScript. He wrote the JSON. He invented JSON, whatever. He wrote a great book about JavaScript. You can get the O'Reilly official JavaScript guide is like 700 pages. And Douglas Crockford wrote a book called JavaScript, The Good Parts, and it's this big. And one of his core insights was that inside all of this like weird, messy, not very elegant disaster of a language, there was a beautiful core. And if you just use the beautiful core, I mean, you don't have to use the bad parts. So if you just use the good parts, you can actually write some amazing things. Because secretly, and I see for the first 15 years, I didn't even understand this, but JavaScript looks like Java or C, but it actually behaves more like Lisp or Scheme, and it wants to be like Lisp or Scheme. Brendan Eich, who wrote it, was consciously emulating Scheme. It's very function-oriented, lambda-oriented, and it's not like a functional language. Anyway, it's worth learning just because it invites you to think in a totally different way. And
What's the book called?
JavaScript, The Good Parts by Douglas Crockford. He also has some good videos online kind of explaining. If you look up Douglas Crockford JavaScript, you'll find his tutorials. And Brendan Eich, the creator of JavaScript, he points out that people keep trying to replace it, but it's always risen to the challenge. And people are doing amazing things now with front-end web app programming, and increasingly with Node, with back-end programming. Anyway, that's enough fanboyism about Node or about JavaScript. So I wrote the same script, the check stuff PL sample script. All it does is create a random integer between 1 and 20, and then it processes the warning and critical arguments and then returns, whether the random number is within those thresholds. So it's just for kind of an example. So I implemented that in Node. We start off defining our plugin name. We use the commander library, which is for argument parsing. One thing that's kind of cool and spooky about it is that it actually just parses these strings for the definition. So it knows the angle brackets are, it knows the -- format is the long variable name and allows the short one-letter flag for the same thing. This allows you to override the random number generator and give it the answer you want to check. So that handles all the argument processing. Then if there hasn't been a value supplied as an argument, then we generate a random number. We format the message, and then we check and we format the performance data. I guess I could still make that more modularized, like the Perl module. And then we check the value against our critical threshold if we have one, and against our warning threshold if we have one. Otherwise, we exit OK. So that's the actual functional part of that. The rest is some objects I wrote to kind of emulate the Nagios plugin module for parsing the range string, checking it, checking the value against it. Did anybody here write JavaScript? Anyway, we need to publish this as a module, and then other people will use it. Oh, so let's look at that in action. So yeah, if I run it with no arguments, it always returns OK. If I give it the -h, it gives me the usage information. If I give it thresholds, then the random number will alert. So in this case, the random number was 16, and that was above my threshold. You can do fancy things like make the critical range. Ooh. Invalid range. I don't even. You can, the @ symbol inverts the ranges. So it would make it warn if it was warn if it's under 4, or critical if it's under 11. Let's see. Why didn't this work? Oh, yeah. If you give two numbers with a colon, that defines the OK range, and anything outside that range is critical. So if we do, yeah, so if our range is 1 to 11, that means it's OK, and outside of that is critical. And if we get an 8, then it's OK. One thing you can do with this is you can kind of define concentric areas of okayness. So you can say, so in this example, our like extreme limits of okayness are 1 and 11, and our really okayness is between 4 and 8. So an example of 5 is okay, but an example 9 will be outside the warning range, so it will warn. Or 12 will be outside the critical range. And so it will go critical. Anyway, so that's how those, that's why you might want to use a library for your threshold range checking stuff, because it allows a lot of expressiveness in your arguments. All right. We have oh good, we're doing just great on time. Okay, so this is an example I previewed the other day. I thought that it would be good if Nagios could warn me if I don't have enough friends. So I wrote a Facebook checking program in check script in Node. It uses the Facebook Graph API. One of the tricky things about Facebook is that they care about privacy, and they're just not going to hand out my list of friends to anybody who asks. So I had to register my plugin as an app, and then my user account had to grant access to the app. So that looks like, so if I go here, so you get to see my real live Facebook page. Maybe if I make this full screen, I'll be able to get to the... So if I go to account settings here and go to apps, my app here, it has, it's been granted permission. So that means that I can actually, I only have, it's warning. But it actually returns a JSON data structure of all my friends' names, and it just takes the count. And I thought it would be more realistic if I actually showed the names. So my Facebook friend with the lowest number is Colleen Fox. Somehow she joined Facebook before it was cool. So she's got a really low ID number with like 5 digits. Everybody else has like 9 digits or something. Anyway. So the other day, in my first presentation, I asked for friend requests, and I got 2 friend requests from people at the conference. So if I quickly, I don't know who that is. Oh, that's a relative of mine. I don't even know her. At least these people I've been to a conference with. I had breakfast with Robert this morning. Are you here, Robert? Oh, hi. Yeah, he's my best friend now. So now I've gone from warning to okay. So this is kind of a silly example, but I realize that social media is really important to a lot of companies, and this could actually be the ultimate end user monitoring. Like if you start having fewer people, if you have people unfriend you or your company on Facebook, it might mean that there's a drastic problem with whatever your online service is, for example. Quickly, let's look at the code for this. Same thing, we define the, wait, that's the wrong one. This is just the central section. Most of I'm using a Facebook library for Node. What's it called? Draco Blue. Node Facebook client. The NPM package manager is Node's solution to DLL hell, and it works pretty well. So you can install it like this, and then like I said, the permission stuff was the tricky part. I think it would be easier, actually, if you were checking your company's page. I don't think you'd have as much privacy stuff to get around. I think you could just get one token that wouldn't expire for checking a page, but I'm not sure. So we take the Facebook username off of the command line. And one thing you can notice is that Node in particular lends itself to this style where there are these nested functions. It's basically calling one routine and then giving it a function to run when that routine completes. So it's the callback function. And that takes a little bit of getting used to if you've come from a more functional programming language. So we get our session. We call the very simple REST URL of the user name or ID /friends. And it gives us the JSON data structure. And we check it against the thresholds. Or we count, just get the length of the array. And then we check that number against the data structure. Or against the ranges, sorry. And there we go. So one more thing. So the code for this is available on Gist. You can go use it if it's helpful to you. You know, if you want to get paged when you don't have enough friends, for example. Or maybe I thought the next thing really would be to post on my wall when Nagios says something else is down, like an event handler. You know, like Nathan won't be available this weekend or something like that. You could just handle that for me. Let my wife know I'm going to be late for dinner or whatever it is. Okay. So I want to close with one of the weirdest examples in our environment that will hopefully horrify you and hopefully inspire you to write your own plugins to deal with whatever it is that you have to deal with. Because I've found that it's actually a lot of the check plugins that are out there are for things that are pretty stable. You know, like, I mean, disks fill up. That's always an issue. But machines really are, modern operating systems kind of run themselves. It's the software that your company pays billions of dollars for and runs on top of the operating system that always fails. In this example, we have something called chart servers, which are actually a Microsoft Word macro written by our main electronic, I work at a hospital, our electronic medical record software. Their solution to printing was Microsoft Word macros. These macros open a Word document and perform a mail merge using the Oracle database. They run in the user session, you know, so a user has to be logged in running Word, and you can watch the Word document kind of build itself and pull in all the data and reflow and get all ready, and then it finishes the Word document and prints it out. It's like, yeah, it was like a twisted genius, like a misguided genius. Like whoever made Word macros do this was amazingly brilliant but wrong. And we need about a dozen of these to cope with just normal load at our relatively small hospital. So this is not an actual photo, but we did literally have a stack of PCs on the floor in the data center running these Word macros. Now they're all VMs, but they're just as bad. Well, they're not quite as bad because they're not a stack of PCs on the floor. So it gets worse, and this is actually one of the best images on the whole internet. I was pretty happy when I found it. If we want to monitor it, because it breaks all the time, because it's Word, it's not a service. It's not even a process that we can tell if it's working or not. WinWord, just the fact that WinWord is running doesn't mean anything. It normally consumes 100% of the CPU for long periods of time. And whether or not it's okay is a complicated question. There are many ways that it fails. These are some examples. That often it fails with some sort of squack that requires user intervention to recover from. So I wrote an AutoIt script that just kind of runs all the time, loops through the visible windows in the user's environment. And it compares, it just looks at the titles, and it knows that, it knows what's okay. So this is the chart server control panel window. That's okay. And something that says Microsoft Word might be okay. And it just compares them against the, against regular expressions to make sure that it matches one of the okay windows. And if not, then we write out the status information and exit. And this allows Nagios to know when it's broken. So in this case, this chart server is broken. There's an unexpected window called Microsoft Office Word. So even though all the services are running and winword.exe is running, this one is broken. So OK is complicated, and custom plugins let you handle your environment. This is actual footage of our server room. And it's an actual server on fire, but the footage is projected on a screen hung between two trees in the great outdoors, and the server is just superimposed. My coworkers were pretty excited about homemade special effects. Which is kind of a metaphor for the whole custom plugin thing. So we have 3 minutes. Do we have any questions or comments? Yes.
So this is actually a general plugin question, because I've had this problem both with custom plugins and the Nagios plugins. If I run them from the command line, I get the normal exit codes of 0, 1, 2. But if it runs through Nagios, I'll get errors of return code 13 out of bounds, return code 128 out of bounds. Do you know what's going on there?
That's always a tricky thing. That's a general problem I have with running anything unattended on any operating system, is that when you run it interactively, you're running it in a totally different environment than it runs from the daemon or the task scheduler or cron or whatever it is. So you have to use tricks to run it with no environment or with the closest environment you can to how it's actually being run. So if you use sudo -l and the Nagios user, you can run it as the user. If you use env dash, it runs it with no environment. So that's a way of approximating what it is. It's really difficult. Like with NRPE, sometimes it's really difficult to duplicate exactly how it's running the thing.
Okay.
My most recent problem, I couldn't get something to run. Let's see, I was trying to get a plugin to run with sudo because it was like a check yum plugin, had to run with sudo. And it just ran totally different for the NRPE user than it did for me. And even using those tricks that I just mentioned, it worked fine for me, but the daemon would try to run it and it would just fail with a weird error. And I finally compared it to a different machine and found out it was SE Linux was the difference. And it just, I haven't totally figured that out, but I don't know.
And
Is that
do you know
helpful?
if those numbers mean anything? Because I Googled it, and one of them basically meant something went wrong, which was not helpful.
That's probably what it means.
Okay.
I don't know. There are probably people here who have way more experience than I do with stuff like that. I don't know.
Just as a comment, check your permissions, because I ran into some similar issues, and they turned out to be permissions issues, and I think I was getting 128 errors, if I remember right. I did have a question about, you were saying in Nagios 4 that the embedded Perl is going to go away. Does that change your examples at all, or can we still pretty much use that?
No, that should still
That
work.
template.
It's, yeah, like Perl is another thing. I see people have problems with Perl modules because maybe the Nagios or the NRPE user doesn't have the permissions on the Perl libraries or whatever the issue is. So as I understand it, I mean, Perl plugins are still going to work with, or Shell or whatever plugins are still going to work with Nagios 4, but they're ripping out the embedded Perl stuff. So it'll be a little bit slower. It'll have to launch Perl and you know, put the whole Perl interpreter in memory, then execute the script, and then it'll exit. So the only thing that would change in my check backup example is you could use the standard minus capital M to calculate the file size instead of using the file stat module. That was the only, yeah. And it's a different, it's more forgiving to not run embedded Perl because Perl launches, runs your script, and then goes away. With embedded Perl, Perl stays resident in, Perl stays running. The Perl executable is part of Nagios, and it's running all the time, and then it executes your scripts continuously, and so you can have, they have to be coded a little more defensively is what one of the documents says. So it'll be easier.
All right, thanks.
But less performant. But they'll make up for it or something. I don't know. I love Perl, but I feel like, I don't know. I feel like Perl is waning. Someday they're going to release Perl 6 though, right? And then it'll take over the world someday. Any other questions? All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Nathan Vonnahme.
Thanks.